So hello, everyone. I'm Nico Larco. I'm a director of the Urban's Next Center here at the University of Oregon. And we are very excited to have you all here for the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be doing around the Urbanism Next topics that we love to talk about. The topic today is going to be COVID-19 and the office, really thinking about what's happening with the future of the office and how it's going to affect commuting, how it's going to affect real estate issues, and the sort. Urbanism Next is an organization here at the University of Oregon where we focus on the impacts of new mobility, AVs, and e-commerce on cities. For a long time, we've been looking at the disruptions that these things, how they're going to be disrupting cities. And in the last few months, we've realized that COVID-19 is another one of these disruptions. So our work has pivoted a good amount to start thinking about how it is that COVID-19 is going to be affecting things like land use, urban design, transportation, real estate, building design, and the implications that has for equity, health, the environment, and the economy. I am very happy today to have a couple, well, first of all, let me thank the people who are making this possible. This is a continuation of our conference that we did this year online, the virtual forum that we had a few weeks back. And we're really thankful for all of our sponsors for that session that are continuing with us for these webinars throughout the year. So thank you, tremendous thanks to all of them. I'll also mention that we have one other webinar that's coming up. We've got a few of them scheduled. This is the next one that's going to be happening on August 11th, looking at how it is that, looking at pilots all over the country and some internationally, looking at how it is that what makes a policy work, what makes a pilot work, what makes it most effective, how do you get the outcomes that you want, and different kind of models of implementation. And that's going to be with Becky Steckler from Urbanism Next and Carlos Pardo from NUMA. So please register for that coming up. I'll also mention that with all the work that we're doing on COVID, in addition to urbanismnext.org, the nexus that we have there, a great resource for all of you if you're interested. We have a number of pages looking specifically at COVID. So if you have a moment, please take a look at those pages. If you go to Urbanism Next site, up on the right-hand side, you can look at the COVID pages specifically. So today, well, apologies, we've gotten myself confused here with I've lost a slide that gives me, that introduces our guest here. I'm not sure where that slide went. So today we've got a fantastic group of speakers. Two people are with us, which unfortunately their photographs have gone away. But first we have Tricia Reich. She's a senior vice president and the National Director of Research for Western US at JLL. She's got more than 30 years of commercial real estate experience and is directing the statistical tracking and reporting of the commercial office market. Has a tremendous amount of experience, has worked at Grubb & Ellis, has worked at Association for Portland Progress, and spent 7 years at Kempfer Company in Washington, D.C., which is a development company. We also have Leah Riley, who's the managing director of Nelson Nygaard. She spent before that 5 years as the director of PBOT and has been in management at the Departments of Transportation in Chicago and DC, and is on the board of NACTO. And the topic that we really wanted to discuss today was this question of, we know that there's going to be significant changes happening with COVID. One of those changes is really this question of what's going to happen. We've seen a lot of shift to work from home as we're all in lockdown. And the questions that we're asking is, well, what might make some of that stick, and what might the future look like if some of that sticks? And really trying to figure out from a transportation perspective, from a real estate perspective, from an urban design perspective, what kinds of things might we be seeing? And we are thrilled to have our guest today to help us think through these. So with no further ado, I will pass it on to Tricia to start us off.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm going to share my screen now so I can start my presentation. Excellent. Okay, so I am here to talk about the future of office post-COVID. We've just seen the largest forced work from home experiment ever. And many companies have been really surprised by the success of their workers to adopt new technologies and work remotely. Companies are reevaluating their future space requirements. A number of high-profile employers have made really bold statements about work from home being a much bigger part of their long-term plans. So this has led us to the question, what's the future of office space? Is this the end of the office as we know it? So as I mentioned, we've seen some pretty incredible headlines leading us to believe that the office is over. We think this discussion has been really way too simplistic. Facebook grabbed headlines for stating up to 50% of its workforce could be working from home in 10 years. In the same interview, Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook did not have enough office space. In fact, Facebook is rumored to be close to leasing 750,000 square feet in New York City, and this comes roughly 7 months after leasing 1.2 million square feet at Hudson Yards in New York City. Facebook really is emblematic of the complexities of the discussion and the reality of what might happen. Another example, Goldman Sachs CEO said that while there may be some increased work from home, the need for in-person collaboration was really essential to their success. So we think the short answer is no, the office is not finished, because the function and purpose of the office from a company perspective and from an employee perspective is critical for a number of important reasons. The office provides a much broader role in company culture and productivity. It's not really possible to determine permanent impacts of work from home model in a few short months. Assessing the future of office is more complex than that, with a broad mix of factors at play. For the company, the office provides a place to bring people together, to coordinate activity, output, performance, and creativity. It provides a place to showcase brand and culture and is critical in attracting and retaining top talent. For the employees, the office is a place for collaboration, connection, innovation, and social interaction. And the desire for these has not diminished. If anything, they've come into sharper focus over the last 3 months. Work from home or remote work is one of 4 key themes that have emerged as significant in shaping the future of office demand, both in the short and the long term. These themes fall into 4 broad categories, and I'll be talking a little bit further about each one of them. It's important to note that this pandemic has caused the acceleration of these trends that were already in evidence. Distributed work, urban versus suburban locations, work from home, and changes in space design. So to set the stage, I want to just first note that we've had a significant shift in our economy in the United States. In 1990, the top 5 companies based on market cap were all located in the East and 1 in the Midwest. In 2020, the top 5 market cap companies are all on the West Coast, 3 in the Bay Area and 2 in Seattle, and they're all technology companies. These companies are facing rising costs, scarcity of labor, and other challenges that are really pushing them to explore these distributed work options. They are really emblematic of what's happening there. First, the hub and spoke model. Firms have been growing in secondary and alternate markets as they chase talent and quality of life for their employees. They've leased significant amounts of space in markets like Austin, Portland, Nashville, and Denver. In addition to the hub and spoke model, we've seen companies explore movement to lower cost markets and the shifting of back office roles to lower cost submarkets. In the urban versus suburban discussion, COVID has accelerated some of the challenges related to urban density. Public transportation is one of the biggest drivers of this, as JLL survey found more than 30% of people that took public transit pre-COVID want an alternate form of transportation to get to work. In particular, densely populated regions with significant public transit ridership are going to see some movement in the short and midterm as companies plan for reentry. Companies in these and other markets are charting where employees live to inform decisions about where to set up offices including alternate satellite locations in addition to their urban office, for suburban drop-in work, and also finding small co-working spaces to allow increased flexibility for workers. However, we believe that urban markets will remain critical, especially in major markets like Boston, Seattle, DC, San Francisco, where large populations of young workers are living in the urban core. In fact, 70% of corporate relocations since 2010 have been in dense mixed-use submarkets. Once the pandemic subsides, urban footprints will be essential to recruiting skilled talent in leading knowledge hubs. So let's talk about work from home for a minute. Necessity forced this global work from home experiment. While there are benefits to work from home, there are diminishing returns as we learn interaction is key to idea generation and team building. Immediate benefits were less commute times and productivity gains for routine tasks. As innovation, teamwork, and collaboration become more critical, the benefits of working from home start to diminish. And the opportunity costs of these impacts to collaboration and creativity begin to outweigh the savings that you might realize on office space. In fact, early advocates of work from home saw really generally poor results. Those companies that initially championed the work from home experiment reversed course after experiencing quantifiable declines in growth and innovation. Although work from home will increase, we know that, innovation and productivity are quantifiably higher when work is performed on site. So we will see an increase in companies allowing work from home and other hybrid models, but people do still want to go back to the office. A recent Gensler study, which was post-COVID, found 30% of employees want to spend a majority of their time at home. They've seen this, the benefits: no commute, flexible hours, more flexibility in their schedule. But pre-COVID, the number of people working from home was about roughly half of that. However, there really has been a strong desire to return to the office, in particular from younger folks. Perhaps their tiny apartments aren't really conducive to work from home. Their roommates aren't great office mates. They've lost some work-life balance. They have kids at home. And so what Gensler found was that 70% of people said they wanted to spend the majority of their time in the office. So while we have been working from home out of necessity, many folks are anxious to get back to the office. I know I'm, for one, am pretty zoomed out. In the meantime, workers expect crucial changes to the workplace before they're comfortable returning to the office. Let's talk about changes in space design. Over the past 20 years, we've seen office design densify significantly. The most dramatic shift in workplace density occurred in the early 2000s with the elimination of legacy office infrastructure, copy machines, filing cabinets, hard walls, etc. Since 2010, the implementation of unassigned seating fostered continued space compression, but it has been at a slower pace. The rise of the gig economy and a growing share of freelance employees shifted more jobs into high-density environments. However, in the recent past, there has been a backlash to this density, with issues related to noise, engagement, and the ability to concentrate. Today, social distancing as a result of COVID is likely to swing the pendulum back even further and drive increased allocation of space per person, accelerating the move towards de-densification. Ultimately, we think the increase in work from home and the de-densification of office will end up being a wash in terms of demand for office space in the long term. However, in the short term, a shift to considerably lower density is expected as companies consider some of the following options when planning for their reentry: spatial distancing strategies, more work from home and more flexibility, shift work, reconfigured office, enhanced data collection on utilization rates, limiting meeting size, and potential changes to common area amenities. So while we have seen COVID disrupt the workplace, the question is, what will the long-term impacts be on increased work from home and these other trends in office space? These questions are important considerations as we settle back into a new normal. How much work from home will we see, and what will the impact on demand for office space be? We believe it's a wash there. Will we see a permanent shift in space design and more square feet per person? We are seeing that start to happen. How will modifications to building operations change after the pandemic scare has subsided? And what about amenities and communal spaces? Will there be significant changes there? All these are the questions that we need to consider when we're thinking about the future of office space. Thank you very much.
All right, I will. This is Leah Riley. Let me get my screen shared. All right, everybody see my screen? Somebody say yes.
Looks great. Yes, looks great.
Say somebody needs to tell me. All right. So like Trisha just said, we know that working from home is going to continue. We know this trend really started in 2016, and that's when we saw the largest year-over-year increase in working from home. And since then, the stats have kept rising and are now sky high. But like Trisha said, the question is how many are going to continue to work from home once it's safe to return to our offices? But we know that today more than 50% of the workforce can work from home. However, even before the coronavirus pandemic, people were increasingly using delivery services such as Amazon to avoid going to the stores. And since March, Amazon has hired over 100,000 new workers to keep up with demand. We were already preparing ourselves for restaurant takeout as well. When lockdowns began to go into effect, the restaurant industry was hit pretty hard. But now that restrictions are easing, the restaurant industry is pivoting, and now food delivery services are surging, and month over month, the usage is continuing to increase. So with all the conveniences already available to stay at home, on top of that, people are now looking to be free of their commute. In 2018, which is the last year that we have complete data available, Americans spent an average of 28 minutes on a one-way commute, which equates to more than 200 commuting hours per year. So given that 50% of full-time employees can work from home, we also know that 43% of them want to work from home after the economy has reopened. And one of the top reasons why they want to do so is to save time from commuting. Also, when the lockdown started, we saw traffic plummet precipitously, and this had a really positive impact on air quality. Data from satellites found that for the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, March 2020 had the lowest atmospheric NO2 levels of any March since at least 2005. And measures of particulate matter in the air dropped more than 40% in the US after lockdown measures were put in place. And this is also shaping people's attitudes about returning to the office. Research that was published in 2018 revealed that commuters experience up to 30% more pollution than those who work from home. And people are aware of this, and they're aware of their impact. And also it's driving a desire for them to avoid a commute. And in fact, if you work from home only 3 days a week, you can reduce your CO2 footprint by more than 2.2 tons annually. So what does this mean for our transportation networks? Across the globe, cities are taking advantage of fewer people commuting to reallocate road space to alternative modes and to enable a more interconnected urban life. But the question remains, is it enough? And are these changes going to be permanent? I wish I could take credit for this title on the slide, but I can't. I was in an interview in the news the other day, and it just made me laugh. So I thought it was the best. It was the best quote I've seen in a while. But Let's just say beginning in March, bike sales started increasing exponentially, and they were up 121% in that month alone. Sales are largely booming because people are stuck at home and they're willing to try something new for exercise, but also it's also essential workers who are adapting to scaled down public transit. And right now is a very opportune time for those who might be nervous about sharing the streets with cars. And in response, mayors across the country have closed streets to encourage cyclists and joggers to exercise. In addition to regular bikes, e-bike sales are skyrocketing. E-bikes can extend the distance that people are willing to ride. They can also be more accessible for those who are less fit or able. US retail sales of e-bikes in the first quarter of 2020 grew 90% over the previous year. For some specific companies, Brompton sales are 5 times higher month over month, and they're gaining as restrictions are lifting. Van Moof sales are up 138% in the United States. Electric e-bikes reported a 140% increase in sales since March 15th. And Rad Power Bikes said its April sales increased a whopping 297% year over year, which has vastly exceeded their expectations. What's also interesting is their sales to business customers in the delivery sector also rose 191% from March to April. But what we don't know, right, is this trend going to continue? It appears that it will, at least in part. 50% of new riders are saying they're going to continue to ride in a post-COVID environment. And so this has longtime cyclists really hoping that the unexpected bike boom results in lasting changes to city infrastructure, like protected bike lanes and regional networks of trails that allow for safe commutes. When we look at bike share systems, the results have been mixed. Early on in the crisis, bike ridership grew because many commuters opted to get out of confined trains and buses. But as isolation orders kicked in, usage started to decline. There have been a few bike share systems that have closed temporarily, but others have stepped up their role in providing essential mobility, including for healthcare workers. And the lockdowns across the country are also really impacting parking. One's just a place for parking near your destination. Our urban curbs today have become a lively, nonstop interaction of countless modes of transportation. There are cars, delivery trucks, ride-hail app vehicles, bicycles, e-scooters, and pedestrians. So Spot Hero, this is an app that finds and books parking spaces, published some data in April that showed an astonishing decline in parking demand. With businesses shuttered, many people working from home, the demand for parking is down 90% since mid-March, and this decline is hitting every sector of the industry, from airport lots into privately owned residential spaces. So depressed demand means overall parking revenues are way down, especially for cities in which much of their parking revenue comes from off-street. The decrease in revenue is also attributable to many cities lowering or eliminating parking fees. And the long-term impact of this decreased revenue will have a lasting effect on city DOTs, many of whom are very dependent on this money for their routine operations. So the post-COVID horizon seems to be stretching out further, so it's hard to say what's going to continue. But as that horizon stretches, leaning into flexible management options at the curb, so regulations can be adjusted as circumstances evolve and recycle, and in garages so that rates and permits support variable commute schedules and modes, becomes really vital. Cities are already exploring new methods of gathering, exchanging, and interpreting data to set regulations that manage curbside demand and make very efficient use of the space. And these best practices were already being embraced by cities before COVID, so those that were doing so will have better benefits during and beyond COVID. And so my advice to cities is to regulate flexible curbs. And these start with a full digitized inventory that follow with performance monitoring that demonstrates which of the regulations are getting traction and which could be better adjusted to serve evolving needs and demand. So cities need to focus both on accommodating curb-based mobility services like scooters and lift cars, and keep them from overtaking the curb at the expense of walking, cycling, transit, parking, and loading. Micromobility is also changing because of the pandemic. Several companies are downsizing and some have lost their VC funding, but these companies are a critical part of the transportation system, and by pivoting, they can remain standing. By offering free rides, repositioning their systems, and implementing strict sanitary protocols, several companies are positioning themselves for success. Just this week, Lyft published some data that shows how the users of their micromobility offerings are different. They've seen an increase in trips to and from bike share stations near hospitals across their markets. Many of the folks riding to and from hospitals are members of their critical workforce programs, where they've given over 350,000 free rides. And Lyft has found that 80% of these riders are brand new to their bike share and scooter programs. In New York City, over 60% of the critical workforce program participants are women, which is contributing to a record high female membership in the city bike system. And Lyft has also seen a decrease in travel during peak AM commute hours, but this is likely due to shelter in place and folks working from home, and more critical riders, workers riding with non-traditional hours and more recreational trips. The length of trips for bikes and scooters is up, and this is likely due to increased recreational riding and potentially filling gaps in transit service. And if you look at San Francisco and LA, there was an increase in trips along transit routes that were discontinued. Similarly, Lime and Spin have also recently published data echoing this same information. So the long-term impacts to the micromobility industry aren't wholly clear, but our research indicates that there's going to be a consolidation of private operators into potentially more resilient and diversified companies, or companies with larger market shares. For example, Uber's purchase of Postmates and Lime acquiring Jump. There's going to be growth in personally owned micromobility like e-bikes and scooters, due to the demand for individual travel combined with the financial stress on the shared operator model. We believe that TNCs are going to experience lasting damage to the pooled ride-hailing model and a growth of TNC transit partnerships to replace discontinued bus lines in low-density areas and ambulatory paratransit rides. And we also believe there's going to be increasing regulatory attention to TNC electrification and commissions, largely spurred by the new California framework. So given all of this, what should cities be doing in terms of micromobility? You need to closely track bike and scooter share trip patterns and trip lengths, and do whatever you can with less money, like temporary or tactical curbside changes that support safe, increased biking and scooting while also increasing goods and delivery access. And begin rethinking regulating the provider and instead focus on regulating for mobility outcomes. If cities can pivot in this direction, it could lead to a more mode agnostic umbrella regulatory framework for the mobility service. Transit has been one of the hardest hit industries. Ridership continues to decline, and absent the infusions from the federal government, it would likely be bankrupt. And if the federal government doesn't step in and provide more funding, we may lose a mode of transportation that is critical to air quality and urban connectedness. We know that our most transit-dependent populations overlap significantly with the essential worker populations who have continued to commute throughout the past several months. They are largely lower income and disproportionately brown and black and can't afford to turn to cars. While many more affluent white-collar workers are expected and even encouraged to continue working from home, other people whose jobs can't be done from home are going to have to continue to commute. So according to Transit, which is a mobile app that provides real-time public transit data by using real-time public transit data and crowdsourcing, pre-crisis, Transit had a 50-50 gender split. Now 56% of its riders are female, while only 40% are male. In some cities like Philadelphia, more than 68% of riders are women. So if essential workers are indeed the ones taking public transit, women seem to be significantly more essential. And the racial makeup of transit has shifted under quarantine. We've seen a remarkable white flight from public transit. Among whites, public transit ridership has dropped by half, and Black and brown riders now make up the majority of transit users. And of Black riders, 70% of them are female. And among those still riding, very few take public transit for leisure, and even fewer are using it to get to school. The bulk of people still using public transit, 92%, are using it to get to work. And almost 20% of them are in food prep. These are your grocery store workers, your bakers, your butchers, your takeout chefs, and folks who are manning your liquor store. And another 20% of the remaining riders are in healthcare. In some cities like New York, up to 35% of remaining riders work in healthcare. So without adequate transit service, we risk overcrowding, which puts healthcare workers and everyone else at greater risk. Barely 5% of the remaining riders are high-income workers. More than 70% make under $50,000 a year. Only 9% of transit riders have a car, while another 6% have access to one if they need to drive. For the remaining 85%, public transit is their go-to method of transportation. And unsurprisingly, car access is the lowest among low-income workers. The richer you are, the more mobility alternatives you have during this pandemic. So what can cities do? Strategies that seek to increase transit use need to continue, but they also need to be complemented by an increased focus on advocating for maintained service and rider health and safety. And this needs to include advocating for increased funding and new funding sources to help maintain access to jobs for the most transit-dependent commuters, and for a faster return to full operating capacity as transit demand returns to previous levels. And we really need people to emphasize the real vectors for transmission, which is indoor social gatherings. Emphasize the importance of transit for essential workers and making the best use of available roadway space. Improve transit priority in every way possible, and reinforce the idea that masks are the prevention for transmission of the virus. Right now, transit vehicles are being cleaned at a rate unseen in history. In terms of public places, they are likely one of the cleanest places a person can go. So wear a mask and take the bus. Cities are faced with a choice. They can either figure out how to dedicate even more space to autos, or work to improve transit priority and encourage a more realistic view of using transit as a way to move around the city. And this is predicated on the principle that individual autos occupy space, and they occupy a lot of space, and space that's not available in most cities. As the coronavirus lockdowns loosen around the world, city leaders are scrambling to address a new problem, which is the prospect of gridlock worse than before the pandemic. In many cities, officials are worrying that people are going to avoid public transit for fear of catching the virus and decide to drive instead, which is going to push vehicle traffic higher than ever. And we already have warning signs. More than 30 large cities coming out of lockdown, including Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Oslo, and Geneva, recorded congestions on their roads in mid-June compared to the same period last year. So the pandemic, though, has given leverage to city officials to do things that had been potentially contentious in the past, like taking space from cars. So to get ahead of what could be halting gridlock, cities need to get serious about congestion pricing now. Congestion pricing can improve the lives of most people who own a car, and for all of those that don't. It can maintain free-flowing traffic on freeways, even during peak hours. London, Singapore, Stockholm, and other cities charge tolls for drivers on important roads at peak hours to manage traffic, and many more cities like New York and San Francisco are poised to follow. Life will be much better after we get used to and learn to appreciate freeways that are free-flowing, because they're not free for low-occupancy vehicles. So, in summary, my recommendations to cities are to make sure that all those new bikes are able to safely share the road, including the e-bikes, amplify the positive environmental impacts from COVID and commit to them, track micromobility data at the most granular level possible, focus your micromobility regulations on outcomes, not the provider itself, implement a flexible curb program, advocate for transit across the board and give buses priority on your roads, and implement congestion pricing. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And I'll ask Trisha to turn on her video as well. Thank you both. That was fantastic. So first, let me just say for the audience that we've got, if you'd like to ask a question, I'm going to ask a few questions that we've been looking at. But if you'd like to ask that question, you have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to ask there, and all the panelists will be able to see that. So please use that. So let me start. So as we've looked at COVID at Urbanism Next, some of the things that we've been thinking about is that as we look at what the long-term impacts are going to be, there's a few different variables that we can consider. One of them is just how much time, how long we're in this transition phase, because as you know, the longer that we're in here, the longer that we're going to have these habits that start to be that starts to become norms for us. Another big one is obviously, will we be scared about of a new pandemic, right? Or in 3 years from now, do we think about back to how crazy this time was, or are we thinking about, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're in like another third, fourth phase of this thing? And so one of the questions I have for you, I'll start with you, Tricia. Really appreciate your presentation, especially as you were talking about this idea of a wash between the people who we'll have more people working from home, but we're going to need more space per person. So if we think just about the commercial real estate market, things will more or less be a wash, right? So the question I have, though, because this will affect the stuff that the work that Leah does, is how much do you think, I mean, in the chart that you showed, there was 56% of people that were in that survey didn't want to work in the office full time, right? So I agree completely. We're not going to see this wholehearted, everyone's going to work from home all the time. But if we're in this for 12 months, and if we see productivity opportunities that might not be 100%, in other words, we can't do everything, but there's a lot of things that we can do from home, and there is this 56% of people who don't want to be there full time, what percentage of people do you think might continue to be working from home? And I think might continue to work from home in terms of that they're not going to the office every day of the week, right? Because that we could see significant transportation impacts.
Yeah, I think we definitely are going to continue to see a lot of people work from home until there is a vaccine. You're right about how long this lasts really does impact, are these changes permanent or not? There are a few issues to consider. First, companies are in a really a situation where they really want to preserve capital, and they have leases that you sign are there typically 5 years or 10 years. They cannot pivot in 4 months and cut their space in half. They may try to sublease some of their space, but if no one else is leasing space, then that doesn't really help them much. In addition, in terms of the preservation of their capital, many of them, rather than redesign their spaces, we have not seen a single company that is in the middle of designing their space stop and change radically what they have planned. What they are doing is creating a situation of shift work, or people sitting in every other cube, and allowing people to come in on 1 week, and then they have a day for cleaning, and then the next shift comes in the next week. So while you may be working from home, you still are gonna have to go into the office, and a lot of people are not too excited about sharing a space, a cubicle, or benching or desking because of the health concerns. So you still have to have space for those people. I do think that if this lasts beyond 12 months, all bets are off around what's going to happen.
So actually, well, I'll get back to that in a minute, because one of the questions is these kind of time horizons that we should be thinking about. But let me ask Leah, for you, kind of a similar question of, so we've seen, I mean, the data that you're showing, dramatic impacts on transit. Thankfully, there's more bicycle use that's happening, huge increases potentially in auto use, potentially huge increases in parking. I know that's the first thing that went through my mind when the CDC said everyone should be driving to work on their own, right? Just like, where do you put all those cars? What do you think might be a little bit crystal ballish here? We're not going to see 100% of people can't work from home anyway, and we'll get to that in a moment. But of the people who are working from home today, we're not going to see all of them staying there. What do you think might be the long-term implications of how much might we see a shift in work from home, and what do you think is going to decide those things? So how much of a shift do you think we'll see? What do you think are the variables that are going to decide that? And what do you think the implications are going to be to the transportation system overall?
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see large numbers of people working from home. You know, I shared some data in my presentation about what people are saying right now, as did Tricia. I mean, if I can use my own company and my parent company, Perkins Will, as an example, we've done internal polls and surveys, and overwhelmingly, I mean, more than 80% of people don't want to come back to work until it's absolutely safe. But we are in an industry where we're privileged enough to be able to work from home and don't have to commute. I think that this is going to continue until people feel safe. And right now, people don't feel safe. And if people, there are employers who are beginning to require people to come back to work. And I think if there are increasing mandates for people to return to the office before they feel safe, that is going to see a remarkable increase in people driving alone because they are scared of catching the virus. But hopefully, optimistically, at least during the warmer months, I think that we're going to see people biking a lot more. Those bike sale numbers are just tremendous. And I can only hope that that sticks and that people, if this continues through the sort of less desirable commuting months on a bike, that people learn how to gear up and get the right equipment and stay on their bike instead of getting in their cars. Because if they don't, we're going to see just insane traffic. Like if we look to the rest of the world of what's happening, that could be one of the really negative impacts that comes out of this.
So let me ask both of you. Well, what do you see as the differences geographically in terms of what the impacts might be in terms of two situations? One, kind of urban suburban differences that we're going to see with all this, and two, differences in different parts of the country. Some of the, God, I think it was Leah that you were showing the slides of, transit systems around the country, and you know, Seattle I think had like 56% reduction versus other areas much smaller. Do you see more or less impacts in different parts of the country, and why? And then the urban and suburban question.
So the question around urban, suburban, I think there are, we can look at technology companies as an example of what some companies did before COVID to when they had workers in really dense environments where commuting was a real problem. They started doing shuttle service where they would provide that service. And I think that that is an option to avoid people having to get into a car by themselves. It'll look a little different because you aren't going to cram into a little bus. You're going to probably need a little more space. Maybe there are partitions. Who knows exactly what's going to happen, but that is an option. There are also, we have heard about basically pop-up offices in suburban areas that are closer to where some of the workforce is. But as I mentioned, in a lot of the dense urban environments, a significant amount of the workforce is in urban areas. So they're able to still get around on a bike or scooter or what have you. So this bifurcated location could be an option. And I think the other is changing work hours. Sometimes what we have seen in some markets where people come in a little earlier and leave earlier, and then another group of people come in a little later and leave later, that could potentially help with the commute. I mean, I think everyone agrees driving alone in your car is not going to be sustainable long term. And a return to everybody doing that is really not going to work.
I think so, Nico. I mean, similar to what Tricia just said, the majority of our transit systems are in large, dense urban areas, and they have across the board seen just a devastating decline in ridership. I don't know. I don't know what the future is going to look like, but the data that we're looking at more right now is how many of the bus routes are being discontinued due to lack of funding. And so that's driving lack of ridership as well. So transit systems are just hemorrhaging and need revenue in order to continue their operations. So we're more closely following how they're pivoting and discontinuing bus service. And one of the things that I thought of based on the previous question, just wanted to get in, is we're also looking at some data in terms of car traffic. We are seeing numbers of people moving out of urban centers and choosing, because they've been able to work from home, they're now choosing to move farther away from urban centers. And so if there becomes a requirement for all those people to return to an office, there aren't great options other than driving generally from suburban areas into urban centers. So that's a concern for us as well, is the urban flight.
So just one thing to follow on to that, Facebook actually was one of the companies that said, you know, if you like want to still work in Silicon Valley but move to Spokane, that's okay. The fine print was that they're gonna adjust your salary by your geographic location, and you know, so okay. So yes, some people may choose. I don't know that. I think that the issue around the social justice issue for me around the mobility of people that make more money, obviously, if they want to pick up and move and go somewhere else and live out in a more remote area and commute to work, telecommute to work, they have to have the space at home, they have to have the technology, they have to have internet service, and they have to be able to afford to do all that. And there are lots of people that can't. And so I think that those considerations really need to be thought through before we can make a determination about that long-term impact.
So let me ask you both. There's a number of questions that we've been getting from the audience asking about kind of building a little bit on what Leah, you were just saying, of people choosing to live further away. And, you know, this has definitely been a theme that we've been seeing, you know, across the writings throughout the country of, will we become a less urban country? Right, and interesting question as well from the chat of, might we become more of a polycentric country, right? So not necessarily that we're going to be going from urban to just suburban sprawl, but urban to maybe these smaller nodes. What are your thoughts on that? And we'll start with Leah.
I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I think there's a strong possibility we could become polycentric. I think what concerns me about the flight from urban areas is the essential worker component of this, that there's still our urban centers are going to continue to be the main thrust of economy and retail, et cetera. And that's even as people move out to the suburbs, it's not like restaurants, cafes, and a whole proliferation of all the industry to support like your social life is going to grow just as fast as people leaving. And so people commuting, the essential workers are still going to be coming into the urban areas. They're going to be dependent on transit. And if people are moving out of the cities into urban areas, they're still going to want to come back to the city to enjoy the theater or dining or shopping. And all of this is, you know, when they feel safe. So I think that we will continue to see some of the flight, but I don't think cities are going to die. I don't think it's going to be a complete exodus and it'll be urban versus suburban. So maybe whoever suggested the polycentric is onto something there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we have seen, right, this increase in, and I think a good hint for us is, what do these suburban nodes look like? A lot of them are very mixed use, very urban light, if you will. You know, they are centered around transportation. People still want a walkable community. They still want to be able to live where they can walk to a restaurant. And so it's not your grandfather's suburbs. It is a much more urban-like suburban setting. And I mean, that's what a lot of people want, that end up working in an urban setting or in an office setting.
I've heard that from a number of people in the real estate sector that we're seeing a strong continuation, acceleration of a trend that we're already seeing of not from urban to suburban, but from urban to like the semi-urban or like the neighborhood type commercial, and that you can walk to. There's a downtown, there's a there. Let me ask you a question. In terms of time, you mentioned, Tricia, a little bit ago, this last 12 months, all bets are off. And I know, in talking to some other people, 3 months seems to be the critical date for restaurants, right? If restaurants can't make it work for 3 months, just a whole slew are going to, unfortunately, go out of business. Are there, as people look forward, none of us have crystal balls, none of us know exactly how this is going to happen, but are there specific, I'd say, time frames that you think are most important, and specific metrics that you think are most important for people to be paying attention to, that might give them a sense of where we're heading, or when you see that thing change, or if, as you said, in 12 months, if we're in this, be careful. Are there any key either dates, timeframes, or indicators, metrics that you'd say people should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, so I would say, and a lot of this in my mind is driven by, we have seen leases getting done even during this time when people can't tour, they can't go see the space, but out of necessity, if they have a lease that's expiring, we are still seeing leases get executed. A lot of them are extensions or short-term renewals, but that's typically a 12 to 24 months. In the real estate industry, don't do leases for 6 months or 8 months. It's a minimum, and if you've already been in a place for a while, it's going to be an extension for 12 months or 24 months. So you can't pivot that quickly. I do think that if we are sitting here 12 months from in March of 2021 and everyone's still working from home, you have a lot more leases expiring. You have a lot more, we will see what the rent collections have been like for office space up until now. I noticed a comment about rent collections. Retail rent collections have been decimated, but rent collections on the office side still remained really pretty healthy, 90 to 85 to 95%. I think that when you start seeing that metric change dramatically, and if we're still here in 12 months from the beginning, then I think you are going to see some more significant structural changes.
That makes me tremendously frightened, I'd say, because it does not seem like we're going to be out of this in 12 months, but it does give you a reason to think. Leah, what are you thinking about in terms of timeframes that you're most kind of have your finger on the pulse of?
I mean, for the sectors that we work in, it's largely on the public side. So public funding, we've been paying very close attention to how cities and states are structuring their budgets for this year and next year, and very close attention to what's going on in the federal government. If the feds don't step in and help save transit, again, I fear the loss of that industry. It's also the same for state and local governments, who are just experiencing a tremendous loss in tax revenue, and they have enough money in their reserves and rainy day funds to carry them through this year and maybe next year. But if this is anything close to what the 2008 recession was, and I think it's going to be much worse because all the indicators are saying that, it took us more than 3 years to climb out of the 2008 recession. In cities and states and even the federal government were furloughing people, laying off people, reducing pay for more than a 3-year period to recover. And so that's what we are mostly paying attention to, and at a more granular level, like what I went through on my deck about like how people are actually using the system. We're paying attention to all of it. If we do this continuing work from home, I think one of the best benefits is the impact on our air quality, which has just been tremendous. I would love to see that continue.
So let me ask, both of you have mentioned it in parts of what you've talked about. the question of equity with this, right? There's lots of different ways of slicing this. One, there's a lot of people who don't have the option of working from home, right? You have to be there and doing essential work. Also, I would say indirect issues of if transit goes away, if transit's extremely limited, people who are using transit as their only kind of means are going to have significant issues. And Leah, Larry, you'd mentioned before the question of congestion pricing, right, which has a whole nother layer of like you have to make sure that is put into effect in an equitable fashion. At the same time, as you all just mentioned, cities are going to be seeing tremendous pressures on the economic side. So what advice would you give to cities in how to make sure that you are addressing the most important equity questions that you've got? Because it's going to be, you know, a tsunami of issues that are coming up. What do you think are the most important things that they need to be paying attention to? We'll start with Leah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think every city needs to be using a racial equity lens in the decisions that they make and how their decisions disproportionately burden who's sharing the benefits and burdens. And throughout history, we have disproportionately burdened people of color, minority communities. And as we're moving through COVID and trying to figure out how we can keep people employed and gainfully employed and have access to opportunity, transportation is the linchpin for how that works because of the overwhelming number of people who are in low income jobs and don't have access to a car or other means of transportation. So I think cities should be thinking very carefully about providing very low income, low cost and safe ways for people to move about the city to get to their employment. And especially if we look at the decimation of transit, it's going to make the need for walking and biking more important. And our transit sector partners are likely going to be increased their partnerships with TNCs. They are going to step in and try to grab up that market share. They're dangling all these free rides right now for everybody, and they're gaining a larger market share, but they're not going to be able to sustain that level of free offerings for a long time. And I fear it will happen after transit's been decimated. They'll start charging people, and we'll see some really negative impacts there too.
I'm really curious, some point in the future, to the potential we'll be doing a webinar on this, on really talking about that, the potential partnerships between transit and TNCs, new mobility companies. Seems like that is absolutely ripe on the horizon. Tricia, I'll ask you the same question that I was asking Leah about kind of what are the most important equity concerns that we need to keep in mind here?
You know, I think we as an industry, as a planning industry, we have to really look inward at the significant part we have played in creating the systemic issues that exist in terms of urbanization, gentrification. I'm part of a panel, a task force with ULI Pacific Northwest that is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think ULI itself has been started to understand that we as an industry really need to focus on the impact that some of the decisions around planning have had on our urban settings and on Black and Brown people, and really work through representation with those communities to try to ensure that we start to address those issues. I think this comes at a really important time for us as a country, and I think that we as an industry need to take a good look inward and make some serious commitments around changing the way we have planned and policies that we've had in the past. And it's not an easy answer. I know it's not an easy answer, and it's going to take a long time. It's not one project and we're good. It's been a lot of years, hundreds of years. So it's going to take a lot of commitment and work from everyone in the industry.
And continual effort, I think, is something that I've heard repeatedly. Thank you to both of you, Tricia and Leah, for taking the time and sharing all this information. For those of you who are listening, we will be posting their presentations as well. I want to quickly, here, let me try this again. Big thank you to all of our sponsors who've helped make this possible. We really, really appreciate their support, and hope you are, can see all that. There we go. I'll remind you as well that August 11th, we're going to be doing the Perfecting Policy with Pilots. That's going to be Becky Steckler again from Urbanism Next and Carlos Pardo from Numo. They've looked at literally hundreds of pilots around the country to see what's working and what's not, lessons learned from that. So please go ahead and register for that. And finally, well, nope. Just as a parting, I think one of the things that we really need to keep in mind is, on the one hand, the depth of and the importance of the issues that are coming at us, how much COVID can change, and on the other hand, not to go off the deep end of complete dystopia. I think the most important thing we can do is be measured in our approaches, making sure that we're really thinking through what some of the real implications might be, and as I mentioned, keeping an eye on what the indicators are going to be, what are the timeframes that we really need to be paying attention to, so we can see what's happening in the future. Thank you so much again to Leah and to Tricia, and we look forward to seeing you all again at the next webinar in August. Thanks so much.